Hi everyone! Join me as I watercolor this July 4th vanilla cake. I started watercoloring several years ago and now starting to pick up on doing some teaching. Here I'm showing that I'm using the color yellow ochre as the base color. I am a 2 paintbrush girl, so that means that I have a paintbrush that's just full of paint. And then I have another brush that's just full of water. I prefer to have as much control as possible with my watercolor. So what I do is I am on wet on dry and I have my paintbrush full of the color and I put it on the paper and I do it in a way that, because already I'm having in mind that I want to create texture with my cake. So I have it as the paint is on there and then I make the dabs, I make those little marks. Then I use the water paintbrush and I start smoothing it and letting the color just flow wherever the water on the paintbrush takes it. So as you can see, I'm showing you a step-by-step of a fairly easy July 4th watercolor cake. If you've seen any of my artwork, you'll know something about me is that I absolutely love watercoloring and drawing and photographing desserts and food. So I thought that this would be a great idea to teach a watercolor of a July 4th cake. So here again, I'm just applying the first layer of the vanilla and I'm constantly going back and forth between my two brushes and creating dab marks. One color only. When I want to start adding more color, what I do is I'm always checking to see that everything is dry and then I apply the next layer. Now I've decided that I'm going to go to the red. And what I'm doing here is I'm just checking to see the color that I prefer to use. And I've decided to go with the Algerian crimson color. And I'm going to be working primarily on making a very light layer of the red. And when I'm finished with that, I'm going to go in there and start creating a little bit of the textured layers of that with doing darker parts of the cake. And you will see that I first apply a little bit of the watery red and then I slowly build it up with adding the darker red. And what I'm doing here is taking my time. Of course, we're on a bit of a speed with this, but this takes a lot longer than you actually are seeing. But I am starting to create those shadows and looking at several images of cakes to see how that plays out. What I want to try to do is make those indents of keeping as much light as possible, as much white as possible. And it's negative space, negative painting. So I'm trying to paint around those white spaces to create the texture that is in a fluffy cake. I'm using cerulean blue for the flag part of the cake. This would be quite an interesting cake to bake. I don't know. I'm not much of a baker, but I'm sure this would be a real challenge for a baker. So I'm always writing on the top of my piece of paper what the colors I'm using. And so far I've just used 3 colors. And I changed the colors by adding water to it. So the water will make it lighter. And if I need it to be darker, I use less water. So I'm now on my 3rd cake to show again where I'm going to go with this. So now I'm working more from top to bottom because, as you will see, I'm going to start introducing the frosting. And the frosting is quite challenging because I have to use a very watery blue. and violet and mix it together to create the white frosting, which is not really white when you're doing a watercolor painting. So you'll see here I'm adding the vanilla, but I'm leaving the space in between because I want to show that I'm going to have that white frosting in the middle of the red layer and the vanilla layer of my cake. I'm only using 2 brushes. I prefer the Silver Black Velvet series, and the size brushes that I use, my go-to size brush is always a size 4. I really need a fine tip, so when I'm creating those edges, that I can use a very small tip, and it's very controlled. And I've had this brush for about 4 years now, and it's doing very well for me. It's still holding its tip. Another size that I'm using is a size 8 Silver Black Velvet. And then I have a Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 3. And I use that when I'm really working on dabbing. I never use it for anything other than dabbing that first layer of paint that I put on. I want to dab it with water to have it flow, have that color just organically flow wherever the water it's going to take. Because with watercolor, you could lose a lot of control. I'm type of a person that likes to have some control. So I would prefer to, again, work on a piece of paper that's already dry and just apply the water as needed. You'll see here that I'm starting to make that outline of the frosting. And again, this is a bit challenged because I have to paint around the white. I want to keep as much white as possible because there is no white watercolor. So you have to really be very careful, and this is where I use a lot of water because I want to just have that hint of the blue violet color, that has this like kind of lavender periwinkle tone. So I'm starting here at the top. That's going to have a little bit more, and I'm trying to create those, when you see the frosting has these curves and these beautiful peaks, and I'm trying to create some of that. And I'm at this point, I've taken my eraser and I've erased a lot of the pencil lines because now it's like I see the image in my head and I want to now build upon the white and kind of make that, frosting, that white frosting kind of stick out a little bit by highlighting it with the blue violet color. So again, I'm dabbing. Again, this is going very quickly, but in real life, I'm dabbing that color down and I'm just using the water with my watery paintbrush, and I'm just moving it with keeping the white space in between those areas. And there you go. You'll see how I finish this up. It takes a little time. After allowing my picture to dry for about an hour, I went back to it because now I really need to focus in on creating that white space to give a realistic white frosting on top. So I painted the bottom, let it dry for about, 30 minutes to an hour. And now I'm starting to focus in just on creating the white space and painting around the white space. It's negative painting, negative space painting. And I'm using the very watery blue, cerulean blue with the violet, and I am now creating those curves and that frosting like texture. And it's a bit of a challenge because you have to have very little water on your paintbrush. Although you want your paint to be very watery, because it's always better to start very, very light and then to build to very dark. So I'm now creating with the tip of my size 4 brush just little curves here and there. And then I'm taking my Winsor Newton size 3 brush and I'm dabbing along the way, and that's full of water. But it's what I typically do is I take my size 3 brush, I put it in my water jar, and then I wipe it on an old Scott towel or old towel. And then I apply it to where I just put the color down. And I'm slowly building up all those layers. And I'm creating the shadows as best I can without having anything, leak into the other. That's why I really prefer to have everything as dry as much as possible. And I build the layers over and over again. I build it. It's always good to just walk around in between layers. Just take a walk around your room, do some stretching, and then go right back to it. So you'll see here that I'm now back to the blue part of the flag. I'm trying to be conscious by the fact that I want to use like a white gel pen when this is dry, just to create a little bit of, dots for the stars. It's just the, illusion that there is some kind of white there. So as you will see that I am, building up all those layers to create the texture of the cake, because I absolutely love trying to create those like little pockets of the darkness that you see on a cake. And I'm slowly building them up. And what I try to do is I try to kind of outline a little bit of if I see that there's a light area on the cake, I try to build up around it to see if I could just create more of the texture, more of the depth. And this is kind of the way I work. I use 2 paintbrushes. I slowly do this with building the layers, always starting with, the layers to be light and then building the color and everything. I'm a big fan of doing wet on dry because that's where I can have the most control. And I hope that you enjoyed my video on this July 4th vanilla cake. And I'm looking forward to creating more watercolor tutorials as much as I can. So thank you again for watching, and have a very happy and safe July 4th.